Good evening, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are still settling into the Zoom room. We're so glad you're here. My name is Christine Lang, and it is my pleasure to moderate the last session of the second annual South Dakota Virtual Vegetable Short Course. Thank you so much for joining us. I see many of you are already dropping a greeting in the chat. Feel free to share where you're from, where you're tuning in from, share your farm name. It just helps set the stage for our invited guests so they can get a sense of who's in the audience today. So I just want to express extreme gratitude to my co-host, Dr. Rhoda Burrows, who helped make this program possible. I want to give a shout out to our funder who allowed a lot of the research to happen that you heard presented, especially on Monday night, and provided support for this outreach as well. So special thanks to South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources for administering the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant that supported this 4-part series. For tonight's session, again, feel free to engage in the chat to share where you're from or things that interest you. And we're going to have some poll questions and interaction coming a little bit later. So feel free to use the chat for that. And then as our invited guest is speaking, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A for Dr. Moriah Bilenky so that we can address those questions at the end of her presentation. So over the course of the virtual vegetable short course, we have had the opportunity to learn about both high tunnel and open fields commercial vegetable production. We've learned about managing insect pests and weed pests. We've learned about improving soil health and a lot of things to consider for soil health in high tunnels. And I think tonight is the icing on the cake that we're going to get to learn about very intentional integration of cover crops. And just so I don't forget, I want to thank everyone, whether this is your first session tuning in or whether or not you've been with us for all 4 sessions. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for all your thoughtful questions and feedback. We really appreciate it. And I heard from the graduate and research team that presented on Monday that they really enjoyed engaging with the audience. So thank you for continuing to be so curious. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues and also one of my old and current and dear friends from graduate school. A cool thing about being in a role like mine is now I get to invite my friends to speak and do webinars with me. So tonight, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Moriah Bilenky, who is an assistant professor of sustainable horticulture at Purdue University. And Dr. Bilenky's research program aims to explore low-input sustainable cropping systems. And her research lab explores the use of cover cropping, reduced tillage, and animal crop integration to reduce off-farm inputs. And I can share from our early days together at Iowa State that is where a lot of that animal integration started. And Moriah did a lot of work with chicken integration for research. Currently, her ongoing projects in the Sustainable Horticulture Lab include investigating the effects of manure type on soil health, weed dynamics, and food safety, and cover crop and crop rotations for reduced tillage vegetable production. Her past work included postdoctoral work at Penn State University, managing a project that explored how to intensify organic grain production. She completed an AS in agronomy from Nebraska College of Technical Agriculture and earned both her BS and PhD in horticulture at Iowa State University. Among the various horticulture projects pursued during her PhD were a multidisciplinary project with faculty in food science, soil health, animal science, and economics, exploring animal crop integration for vegetable crop growers. And again, that's back to the chickens. And I will say, Moriah is one of the hardest working people I know. And like me, she appreciates good, solid science. So one of my fondest or funniest memories with Moriah is the 2 of us working together to harvest her research lettuce crop in a downpour before the full-blown lightning and thunderstorm showed up. Not something I would recommend doing, but just shows you the level of dedication that Moriah has for her work. And she also brings a wealth of real-world on-farm experience. Before starting her PhD, she assisted in the management of a 14-acre diversified vegetable farm, and she also started her own small farm vegetable operation. So I know that tonight's audience is an excellent hands with the expertise of Dr. Moriah Bilenky. And so, Moriah, I'm happy to turn it over to you, and we look forward to learning about summer annual cover cropping, benefits, challenges, and future directions.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk with you all about my experiences with summer annual cover cropping. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that I did as a graduate student at Iowa State when I was with Christine Lang in the trenches, as well as some of the work I've been starting here in this past year at the new position at Purdue. So, okay, we're going to start it off with a poll just to get things going. What are cover crops? So just go ahead and take a minute to select your answer. Okay. Looks like we've wrapped up. Looks like we have a very knowledgeable audience and know what cover crops are, right? So yeah, a plant that's planted not for sale, which is an interesting I guess name for them, cover crops, because a crop actually defines a plant that we harvest and sell typically. So whereas a cover crop, we're using it for the services that it can provide, the soil and the ecosystem. Okay, moving on. Okay, so let's do another little poll. I'm curious to see, what for those who use cover crops or even don't, what you think some common seasons would be for oh, actually, this is the first poll. If you use cover crops.
Thank you, everyone, for voting. I pulled a fast one on Dr. Bilenky and broke one of our questions into two questions. So it's also really fun to see who's using them and if they still are. For all the folks who have only tried cover crops once, if you'll maybe humor me and in the chat share with everyone, maybe what was something that prevented you from doing it again? We can swap a few good, bad, ugly stories. And then back to you, Moriah.
Hey, yeah, it looks like we have, everybody has filled out the poll. So it looks like we have quite a few who've used cover crops, but yeah, and several that have tried it just once. And I think probably after my talk, you might see why you might only use them once and then give up, because it can be challenging sometimes. But hopefully I'll also share with you reasons why to continue using cover crops. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to hear from you, again, we're going to do another poll. Again, now this is where I was talking about the seasons for cover cropping. So for those that have used it, what season have you used cover crops in? It's interesting to see folks that have used summer cover crops, since that was going to be, my segue into some of the work that I'm doing, that it's not as common as spring or fall, but it seems to be a split between summer and fall, and that might just be due to maybe shorter springs in where you are. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so there's several common seasons for growing cover crops. Pretty much any season you can have a cover crop growing. In the spring, in the summer, you can have perennial cover crops, or grow them in the fall to winter kill. or in the fall to overwinter. So let's talk a little bit about common ways of planting and then terminating. So we have two more polls, and these will be the last two. But I'm curious to know how you all, for those who use cover crops or those who have used it once and don't want to use them again, how you did plant them. And then the other poll will ask you about how you terminate them.
And I am dying to know if anyone has spread cover crop seeds with a drone. I know that many of our agronomy friends are doing that. But if anyone has spread cover crop seeds with a drone, boy, do I want to visit with you more.
Somebody
Oh.
said,
Somebody said yes. You're going to have to send me a message and let me know who you are. I'm so curious how that went for you, or if you're willing to share with everybody. Fun. Yes, I'm glad we asked, Maria.
yeah, so, and I'd like to know, if you've done it again.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, it looks like the majority broadcast seed by hand, which is a great way to get into using cover crops. Especially, if you don't have a drill and a tractor to pull it with, and can be very effective with ways to, incorporate that seed. So let's hear about how folks who are growing cover crops terminate their cover crops. Okay, I don't see anybody who's used a roller crimper. I thought for sure there would be one.
I'll have my work cut out for me. I'd like to get back into roller crimping for some of my projects. So stay tuned, folks. Roller crimping in 2024 and 25.
Okay, but it looks like several mow or till their cover crops. Some just let them winter kill. And a few are starting to use tarping. Nice. Okay. All right. So we'll just back up here a little bit. So there's many ways to terminate cover crops, which it sounds like many of you are doing either mowing, tarping, and then, there's also your ways of planting. So drilling is a really good way to get good seed soil contact if you're planting cover crops. But if you are broadcasting by hand, you can achieve good results by shallowly incorporating your seed with a rake if you're on a small scale, or harrow or something like that. You can terminate by tilling. It sounds like, so in my talk, I'll mostly be focusing on terminating by tilling, mowing and tilling, and roller crimping. Okay, so I had thought that the majority would say that the times that they typically grow cover crops were in the spring or in the fall, but it sounds like summer cover crops are becoming more popular than they were when I first started researching them. So that's really great. But summer cover crops, the ones that we choose to be summer cover crops, right? They need to be heat and drought tolerant. And although it, might be an odd time to grow a cover crop, because that might be a time when you typically want to be growing and harvesting your favorite vegetable crops or your most popular ones for market. It can also be a good way to cover the soil or have a fallow period without actually having it fallow. build soil health, rotate out of your more common summer annual vegetable crops to something else, and use it as an ecological weed management tool. Okay, so for those of you who are tired and, you know, aren't sure if you want to tune in for the whole thing, I'm actually going to give you all my take-home messages right now. And so that, you know, if you choose to to tune out, you know, you won't miss that much. I'm going to give you all the important things now. So one take-home message: summer cover crops have the potential as an ecological weed management tool, as well as for adding nitrogen to the soil prior to fall cash crops. And so I'll be going into detail about these things later, but these are just my initial take. So some of the challenging things with summer cover crops, right, is that we're typically trying to plant them May, June, maybe even later. And it can be challenging when there's lack of moisture in that time of year, especially if you're tilling to plant these cover crops, as you know, soil can quickly dry out, and there have not be moisture at the seed depth where you need it. You know, supplemental irrigation can help with that, but obviously not everybody has that, or it's not necessarily economical to water a cover crop that's not directly bringing a profit. For summer annual cover crops or summer cover crops, you really want to have cover crops that can establish quickly, because during that time of year, you have your summer annual weeds that are very competitive and can establish quickly. And so choosing a summer cover crop that time of year, especially if you have a very weedy soil, a lot of seeds in the seed bank, choosing a summer cover crop is that is competitive and will establish quickly is important. So cover crops that are going to produce a lot of plant material that have a high carbon to nitrogen content, which are great for suppressing weeds, can also cause nitrogen immobilization. And so making sure that you consider this when using those types of cover crops, right? The high biomass can be good, but it can take some time for them to break down and for the nitrogen to be available. So some supplemental nitrogen at the time of planting your cash crop or vegetable crop following those cover crops is key. Okay, and finally, one of the things I'm going to touch on in this talk is that we studied the potential of the summer cover crop sun hemp to be rolled, to terminate it using a roller crimper. And spoiler alert, it wasn't very successful with 1 year. That's 1 year of data, but there were things that showed that maybe it's still promising as well, because there were certain factors at play that may have confounded things. So we're still interested in examining this, and you'll hear more about why. Okay, so if you're still with me, or maybe those were some juicy tidbits and you want to hear more, I'm going to jump into some of my research from my past at Iowa State. Okay, so this research was, at this time when I was starting this, there hadn't been much research on the use of summer cover crops in the Midwest. And we were interested in identifying those that could be used in rotation with fall vegetable production. And so we evaluated several different cover crops and asked the questions, which ones would be best for managing weed suppression, and which ones would provide nitrogen to the following crop, and which ones would be quick to establish and produce a lot of biomass. So these are the different cover crops that we used: brown top millet, buckwheat, cowpea, golden flax, mung bean, sun hemp, and sorghum Sudan. So we had a variety of grasses: brown top millet, golden sorghum Sudan, and teff, and then a few legumes: cowpea, sun hemp, and mung bean, and then a couple of broadleaves of golden flax. And on the panel, you can see the seeding rates that we used in kilograms per hectare for each variety. So this study was undertaken in 2019 and 2020. And so these are just the pictures of those cover crops. So A is that brown top millet, B is buckwheat, and C is cowpea, golden flax, mung bean, which you can see many weeds poking out. We had the sun hemp and sorghum Sudan grass, and then our teff is all the way there on the right, and then our no cover crop sort of weedy control. And this was just some drone footage of those plots when they were in full force, when we were terminating them I think in the second year. This would have been early August. So during the time that the cover crops were growing and establishing, so we planted the cover crops in early June, and they grew. We let them grow for about 6 weeks, and during that time we established some Red Express cabbage transplants to be grown following. And Red Express is kind of a small, a mini purple cabbage. I'd be interested to hear if who has grown Red Express and their experience with it, especially in a low input system. So yeah, so the cover crops, we let them grow for about 6 weeks, and then we collected samples to analyze how much above ground plant material had been produced by each, as well as the amount of weed material that was within those cover crops as well. And then, like I mentioned, as far as termination methods, we mowed the cover crop with a flail mower, and then tilled it with a rototiller. And then we immediately planted. So as you know from my take-home messages, I said that you should likely wait some time, or at least add some supplemental nitrogen, and we're planting those high carbon, high biomass producing cover crops. We did not know. I didn't know this at the time. Okay, so the other thing that we did was we wanted to measure potential net nitrogen mineralization. Basically, that the nitrogen that would be likely to be taken up by the cabbage. And so we use this method called the ion exchange resin strips. And basically, you place these resin strips that can adsorb nitrate or ammonium into the soil, placing them consecutively for multiple weeks, and then extracting them much like you would extract the nitrogen for a soil test, and analyzing that in a method where nitrate is reduced to nitrite by this reagent, which can then does a color change using vanadium chloride. And you can assess nitrate that's in the sample. So then, yeah, so in whatever, October, so we harvested the cabbages, and you can see they were small. Many of them were probably under what their yield potential of, I think they're supposed to be more like a 2-pound cabbage. And many of them were really falling under sort of like the 1/2 to 1 pound size. We also collected some soil samples to get an idea of, how much of the different soil nutrients were being provided by these summer cover crops. And so we took soil samples post cover crop termination, as well as later after we had harvested the cabbage. Okay, so I'll try to sum these up best I can, but basically this graph here on the left is showing us that there was this relationship between heavy cover crop biomass production and weed biomass. So those cover crops that produced large amounts of biomass tended to also suppress weeds very well. So that included our grasses, typically the sorghum Sudan, teff, and brown top millet, but it's also worth noting that this also included sun hemp, which is, again, I mentioned a legume. So some of these grasses tended to create or collect a lot of biomass and suppress weeds, but so did the one legume cover crop sun hemp. As far as the net, the cumulative net and mineralization, the relationship wasn't as strong. It was still significant, but we did in general see that the cover crops, the legume cover crops, tended to have a little bit higher net and mineralization compared to those that were had a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. And I apologize for this figure, so don't stare at it too long because it'll probably hurt your brain. I didn't know it was as fuzzy as it was, but this is just summing up the cabbage yield. So this is the yield of the cabbage from basically the average of all the beds of one treatment, and then showing all the treatments. So we had 20 heads of cabbage in each treatment plot, then replicated 4 times. So this is the total yield in kilograms for each of those 20 cabbages for the different treatments. And you can see the in the first year in 2019, there was quite a difference between specifically the sun hemp, mung bean, and cowpea, and some of the high biomass, high carbon cover crops like brown top millet, even buckwheat, sorghum Sudan, and teff. In the second year, it wasn't as noticeable, though there was still some difference there. And I think it's important to note that these plots were placed in the same spot every year. So the plots that received the teff treatment or the buckwheat treatment were the same in 2019 as they were in 2020. So, that first year maybe was showing the biggest change from what was done before compared to in 2020. So this table is just summing up the soil sample results, mostly just the ammonium and nitrate, the total inorganic nitrogen. And here you can see that post cover crop termination in 2019, again, there was the largest difference between the amount of total inorganic nitrogen right after we terminated the cover crops in the cowpea, mung bean, sun hemp treatments, which were all legumes, compared to those brown top millet, buckwheat, sorghum Sudan, and teff. However, this was not as drastic in that second year. However, there was still a difference between sun hemp and a couple of the other, again, high biomass, high carbon producing cover crops. Okay, so some of our conclusions from that project were that grass cover crops, they tended to accumulate more biomass than the legume cover crops. There were fewer weeds during the cover crop growth and more carbon returned to the soil, but there was a lower estimated and net end mineralization as well as soil inorganic nitrogen. The brown top millet, buckwheat, sun hemp, sorghum Sudan grass, and teff all produce large amounts of biomass. So even though sun hemp is a legume, it was able to produce a lot of biomass and significantly suppress weeds. And I think these ones could be really useful as ecological weed management tools in organic production. So the brown top millet, as I mentioned in my take-home messages, brown top millet, sorghum Sudan grass, and teff, if you're using them, especially in a crop rotation where fall vegetables that you're expecting, good yields to follow, you might want to apply some additional nitrogen or wait some time prior, because they can tie up some nitrogen as the microbes are busy building their bodies with that as they break that material down. Sun hemp, though, it was really effective at producing large amounts of biomass as well as providing nitrogen to the soil and the following crop. And so this crop I find interesting. You'll see in my second part of my talk, that I have particular interest in the fact that it can produce high biomass. They can suppress weeds as well as add nitrogen to the soil. So lots of the time people talk about, cover crop mixtures, using a grass with a legume to sort of get that perfect balance. But it seems like sun hemp has the potential to do both of those things. So just to summarize that even more, if you're interested in summer cover crops, for weed management and carbon additions, think of teff, brown top millet, sorghum Sudan, or sun hemp, as well. Or if you're thinking about, maybe you don't need as much, carbon or weed management, you could consider something like sun hemp, cowpea, but consider that cowpea and mung bean can be slow to establish in comparison to some of your summer annual weeds. So if you have weedy soils, it's a good idea to combine them with something that establishes quicker. Okay, moving on. So that was Iowa State. That was 2 years of work there with summer cover crops. So now I want to just talk about the work that I did this past summer, looking at sun hemp. So basically, the reason I'm interested in sun hemp as a summer cover crop is because of all the reasons I mentioned. It seems like it has the potential to both be used for weed suppression, for generating large amounts of biomass for suppressing weeds, and it has pretty flowers as well. So it has a lot, I think it has a lot going for it. So in this project, we wanted to evaluate the use of sun hemp to be terminated with a roller crimper. And so my reasoning behind that is one of the things that I'm interested in is no-till or reduced tillage vegetable production. And but one of the issues with no-till vegetable production is this nitrogen asynchrony issue that can occur where nitrogen isn't available at the times that we need it because we let the cover crop residues sit on the soil, or often use high carbon nitrogen immobilizing cover crops like cereal rye. And so if we can use a cover crop that can be rolled, that is also a legume, we might mitigate some of these issues in reduced tillage or no tillage vegetable production. Okay. Yeah, so main objective, measure the effectiveness of rolling sun hemp using a roller crimper, 3 different time points. And so we seeded in the 18th of May, 22 pounds per acre, using a Great Plains drill. This was the sun hemp, 67 days after seeding. My student is over 6 feet tall. So he was there to help measure, and you can see my other student there, just over 5 feet tall. Despite that, it didn't grow as well as we wanted to do. We got about 0.6 inches of rain the day after the night we seeded, and then it just dried up for 2 weeks. We didn't use supplemental irrigation. That was a mistake. But then these were the dates that we rolled it. So we rolled it with an I&J roller crimper, and on the 24th of July, 31st of July, and 14th of August.
Maria, this is Christine. Just want to pitch in real quickly. We've had a few people that are really curious. Can you very clearly define what in the world is a roller crimper? And
Oh, yes. So
maybe you have a photo coming up as well, but I just realized I wanted to share that question because it'll give some context for what you're chatting about.
yeah, so I had a picture way in the beginning when I was talking about termination, and then I didn't throw it back in because I didn't get a picture this past summer of our roller crimper. So the picture I had was of roller crimping cereal rye, but I'll just go back real quick. Hopefully. Um, so close your eyes because it's hard on the eyes to watch that. Okay. So you can see there's a John Deere tractor in the top middle where it says rolling. And you can't really see it super well. But it's basically it's a metal implement. It's got this kind of chevron pattern that when you drive over it or drive over the cover crop with it, it crimps the stem in several places, laying it down and terminating its growth. And there's several factors that go into the success of being able to roll cover crops. One is, the cover crop being typically needs to be at flowering for it to successfully be terminated, as well as the cover crop needing to be of similar height or similar height basically across. So uniformity, I guess, is the word that I'm going for. As well as there shouldn't be other like weeds in there that are green, preventing the rolling of going well, because those weeds won't terminate if they are not ready, if they're still in vegetative production.
And
So
Maria, I was just going to shout out for everyone. I found an old article in Vegetable Grower News about some of the cereal rye trials we did at Iowa State. And there's a beautiful photo of a roller crimper like right at the top of the story. So I'll drop that in the chat for context for people as well.
great.
But thank you for that explanation just to set the stage so we can picture it.
Sure. Yeah.
Back to
So
you.
yes. Yeah. Okay. So ideally, this is what you want it to look like when you roll it, and then it should stay down and not regrow. So this was basically the same day that we rolled, and as I mentioned, right, it wasn't that successful. But you can see this where it did crimp the sun hemp in certain places, but you can see the sun hemp does have a very thick stem, and so it did resist quite a bit being rolled. So this is about 3rd of August. About 10 days or so after rolling. And then, so these are some close-up photos of some quadrats of the field. Basically, we took samples of biomass, and we biomass post rolling. And we also evaluated the success of the roller crimper in about 4 weeks post rolling. So from right to left, RD1 means roll date 1, roll date 2, roll date 3. So this was the earliest date, which was about, what was that, 67 days after seeding. And you can see what was happening was some of the sun hemp didn't get completely terminated. I would say a lot of it didn't get completely terminated and was regrowing, which you don't want that, right? That's going to compete with your vegetable crop and basically become a weed. Roll day 2, we had some of that. So that was the 70 or so days after seeding, and you can still, again, we're still seeing some sun hemp bouncing back. Roll date 3, while we still saw sun hemp bouncing back, we saw the most potential for success at this later date, which was 80 or so days after seeding. And so then the question is, right, if let's say sun hemp can be successfully rolled, but only at, in August, well, that was August 14th. Is there even time to even grow a vegetable crop? And again, so here's the plots, again, showing at different times for the different treatments, but you can see how that sun hemp is really coming back in certain places. And so part of this, I think, is attributed to, one, the poor, sort of uneven sun hemp stands that we had. Another thing that could have contributed to it is we had a lot of weeds. We had things like huge green velvet leaf plants that prevented the roller from rolling successfully. So there were several things that sort of were confounding factors in this project, but we did see maybe there's potential. As you can see, there are stems of sun hemp that did get terminated. And so again, so this is just showing our sun hemp dry weight by our different treatments just prior to each of the different roll dates. And so you can see, although, between the control and roll date 1, there, that was the same day. So you wouldn't think that there would be much difference in the biomass. There starts to be slightly some increase in biomass after, 74 days after seeding. But you do see with quite a bit of variation, higher biomass after those 88 days. So one thing from my previous research that I thought was that, 60 days, you'd have peak biomass production for sun, that it wouldn't be that much of an increase. But it does seem that sun hemp can continue to put on significant amounts of biomass if you let it go, which is a good thing to know for as an ecological weed management tool. If you want to have just a long season summer cover crop, maybe you won't plant a fall vegetable after, but you can just let it grow and add quite a bit of biomass to your soil. So the rolling success. So you can see from the pictures, from a practical standpoint, right? If you were doing, commercial vegetable production, that would not be considered successful. We evaluated the roll success, though, what I was calling relative roll success. So we took biomass samples and weighed what was brown that had been terminated and what was still green, and looked at the relative abundance of brown sun hemp to green. And we did see that it seemed that there was some improvement the later you went after seeding. So seeding or rolling at 60 days or 67 days, was not successful at all, but that there was some incremental success as you moved on, especially between, rolling at 67 days and rolling at 88 days. And so here's the weed biomass from our sampling time. So sampling just before rolling at each of the different dates, and post rolling, which was about 4 weeks after. And the thing to note here that we'll be making changes to in the future project was that for basically the two treatments, the control and roll date 1 rolling times, where the measurements were collected at the same time, whereas the others were later in the season. And so, this weed biomass is going to be affected by the time of the year. The post-rolling sampling of weed biomass for roll date 3 was, September 6th. And so a lot of there could have been less weed biomass just because of the time of year, and not just because that time produced more cover crop biomass and there was more there following. That's something we need to look into further in the future projects. So there were 2 things that stood out to us that we thought might be affecting our roll success. One was the height of the sun hemp, and one was the biomass. The relationship wasn't that strong, but it was still somewhat there that, with when the sun hemp was taller, which tended to be at this roll date 3, that the success of the rolling was better. And same thing with the biomass, which again, it's related to time itself, because with the treatments, that when you get into that roll date 3 where you have higher biomass, the success of the rolling was improved. We did also look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio of these cover crops, and you can see that in this, there was no significant relationship here, but we did see between roll success and carbon to nitrogen ratio. But you can see if you want to use sun hemp as a green manure, you might want to terminate it at 67 days or less after seeding. Or if you want to use it to add more carbon with that nitrogen to the soil, then letting it go longer to that second or third roll date time can be better. So this is, one of my last slides, but this was just looking at the abundance of the different weed species that we found within the plots. It wasn't that diverse. There are very few weed species in these plots. You can see that common purslane, which is the orange bar, was very common. And basically, we saw it throughout all the plots, with the highest being in the control plots. Otherwise there were very few differences in species, and none of it was really significant among the different treatments. So you might wonder, okay, where's the horticulture crop in all of this? So we did plant Swiss chard. We no-till planted into the rolled plots, and we did the planting all by hand, and they looked really nice and established well. You can see the common purslane there. And then they got completely decimated by deer. So that was another challenge with this year, was that we didn't get to, despite the not great results of rolling the sun hemp, we also did not get to see how that may have affected the Swiss chard yield. But so 2024 summer, even though we saw overall limited success with the rolling, we did see evidence that there's potential to roll sun hemp. And because there were some confounding factors, we want to try to eliminate those for 2024. And as well as looking at the different roll dates, also evaluate how seeding rate might affect the success of that roll time. And we need to keep the deer out so that we can actually have a crop to harvest. And then future research beyond 2024 for summer cover crops, we're hoping to look at evaluate the negative, if there are any negative allelopathic effects of some summer cover crops, especially for, direct seeded fall vegetables, as, many of those are shorter season, like beets or your baby carrots, but could be affected by some of the summer cover crops that are known to produce some allelochemicals. Going into, if we don't just want to plant sun hemp, are there optimal mixtures that we could use that can balance this, weed suppression and nitrogen fixation, as well as we want to understand whether, how these summer cover crops can play a role in ecological weed management. So just some practical things, thinking about summer cover crops, if you're planting into tilled fields into, dry late spring, summer, irrigation can help to get that established, especially if there's not much moisture in the soil. One of the things that I'm interested in looking into would be, no-till planting into some residue, because then, you'd likely have some moisture there that you could tap into for getting these summer cover crops established. And who knows, maybe we'll be able to plant earlier with some of the at least milder weather we've been having. The other thing, if these summer cover crops can be used as a forage as well, that can increase their potential if you have some kind of hardy cover crop that grows in the summer well for a forage. Okay, so just sort of some last recommendations. Cover cropping, you really need to repeat it over and long term if you want to use it as a way to deplete the weed seed bank, and then let them grow as long as possible to get that the largest biomass potential that there is, again, for suppressing weeds. And again, if you really want it to be successful, if you have high weed seed bank, then it can be really helpful to mow the cover crop throughout the season to prevent weeds that are coming up through that stand of cover crop from going to seed, and improving those the use of those cover crops. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you to all the people behind the scenes who have helped me with both of these projects. Wouldn't have been able to done it without any of them. So thank you. And thank you for staying along with me, and looking forward to hearing your questions.
Awesome. And I just want to highlight for people, I have dropped a link to Dr. Moriah Bilenky's research lab in the chat as well, so you can, save her contact information and follow along. And Maria, would you be willing to maybe stop sharing screen and we'll transition to discussion time? I've seen some great questions coming in, and we're going to get to as hopefully all of those. So again, if you have things you're still curious about, please drop those in the Q&A. And shameless plug, will you please fill out our last event evaluation? We'd really appreciate it. It helps us, learn how to improve our programs, and it also helps us report to those lovely grant funders about what people have learned at our programs. Maria, I'm going to give you a softball question. We had someone who had an observation about some challenges establishing overwintering cereal rye previously. So could you maybe give some tips and tricks, especially on planting windows, for having good cereal rye establishment going into winter so that it'll come back again in the spring?
Sure. Well, that might be a good question for you, since you've done the cereal rye research, and you're probably in the region where they're growing. I'm not sure for South Dakota what are the cutoff, some of the good cutoff dates for cereal rye.
I would say, we'll make this a podcast episode right away. I would say some good dates to keep in mind is sooner is certainly better. One of your goals with cereal rye overwintering is really good, especially if you are going to try a technique like roller crimping for terminating and having a thick mat of rye in the spring, is to have really good tillering. And the sooner you plant, to a point, the sooner you can achieve that. So if you could be, if you're done with a short mid-season vegetable crop and you can get that rye in late August or by like September 10th or 15th is a very broad brushstroke Midwest planting date, great. Cereal rye in general in South Dakota until about the middle of October will still establish an overwinter. But remember, with cereal rye, if you were looking for something to winter kill, it's likely not going to do that for you. It's meant to overwinter and keep growing again in the spring. So you will have to use tillage or tarping or an herbicide application or roller crimping to terminate that cover crop. But there are other grass options, such as oats, that sometimes will overwinter, but will generally winter kill pretty successfully for you. So, okay, I guess that was a warm-up question for me. Now I'm going to punt it back to you. So we have a couple of people that are interested in using cover crops more as a living mulch, which was part of what we discussed on Monday night as well, Maria. But what have been your experiences with, using any of these cover crops as a living mulch and keeping them mowed?
Yeah, so as far as the cover crops I talked about, I haven't used any of them as a living mulch. I have seen folks use things like teff as a living mulch between plastic beds of vegetables, which has looked like has worked well for those who have done that. My experience, my main experience with use of cover crops as a living mulch has been brief, but I used crimson clover, and I found it was challenging, and there was quite a bit of competition with the crop and the living mulch, but it was easy to keep it low, so it wasn't that it got too tall and outcompeted, just potentially maybe competing for nutrients. This was also a crop that wasn't on plastic and probably not enough supplemental nitrogen being applied. But I know, Christine, you're also doing some work with living mulches.
So that was kind of the heart of Monday night's discussion. So if people want to dig deeper on that, I definitely encourage you to watch that recording. And we are going to have a new project looking at integrating some of these same summer cover crops from Dr. Bilenky's work and building on the lessons that she's learned, integrated as living mulches for summer crop production. So I think my current answer for South Dakota is maybe stay tuned. So Maria, based on all of those beautiful summer cover crops, and I'm not sure if you got any of them, took any of them to, a blooming period, but are there any good cover crop or any cover crops that are good for bees that handle very dry, hot temperatures? This person would like to attract more pollinators.
Yeah, so buckwheat tends to be a really good one for that. We did unintentionally take buckwheat to flowering because it grows so rapidly. It's probably one of the fastest to flower cover crops. And so that one was ready to be terminated prior to when all the other ones were, and does a great job of attracting pollinators. I'm not sure about some of the other ones. The golden flax did go to flower, but I'm not sure about the pollinator interest in them. But the flowers were beautiful, bluish purple, but small. So potentially, small pollinators and beneficials would be interested.
Oh, Maria, kind of piggybacking off of that, someone else wants to know, are any of these cover crops fragrant? And as someone who has cut lots of biomass from lots of different types of cover crops, any fragrance? The question being, are some better choices than others for allergy sensitive people, which is a really interesting insight that I hadn't considered before.
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually, the short answer is I don't know, but I did have one of my students who worked for me this summer who had allergies, and when she was in the sun hemp cover crop collecting sun hemp height, that was difficult for her for her allergies. So I don't know, what that relationship is, if it was the sun hemp itself or just flowering plants in general. Yeah, but that's a good question.
So I think that's one we might have to dig deeper on, the human health implications of cover cropping. I like it. Thank you. So this is a question about the size of the cover crop leaf. So thinking about some of these different species and different leaf sizes versus the density of the cover crop. So is there one trait that matters more, like leaf size versus how dense we plant it? Have you ever considered that relationship or come across research on that?
I have not. Um, no, I don't know the answer to that.
I'll share, I don't know that I have a specific study that I can cite and say this has all the answers off the top of my head. But I know, one of the principles with doing diverse cover crop mixes, for example, is trying to mix legumes, which again have that nitrogen fixing relationship with bacteria in the soil, with your non-legume broadleaf, so something quick growing like a buckwheat, and mixing grasses. And part of the logic there is, those grasses will fill the cracks and crevices between the other broadleaves. So there is some logic and some research that's been done to look at, diversifying these cover crop mixes to get some of those different benefits, but looking at the direct relationship of, which is more important, leaf size or shape or even number of leaves versus density of number of plants planted. I don't know if I've specifically looked at that, but it would be a fun question.
Yeah, actually, just going off of that reminded me, I think one of the things, I don't know if this was related to weed suppression, or like what is the benefit we're talking about from
the goal was weed suppression, yes.
Yeah, so the real key, I think, is just rapid establishment, especially ahead of your quickly establishing summer annual weeds. So what we found in previous research is that some legumes are slow to establish in comparison to either some of the grasses or the summer annual weeds. And so thinking more along the lines of what can establish quickly is key. Yeah.
Yeah. And that can be one reason, like with our clover living mulch plots, for our graduate students who talked on Monday, they did use an oat nurse crop, and using some sort of a faster growing grass, especially with some of those pokier perennial legumes, can help. It doesn't completely solve the problem though. So, all right, so back to actually thinking about cover crop establishment. Can you stress again, Maria, the importance of irrigation with cover crops? What are some irrigation techniques for, really good cover crop establishment?
Yeah, I mean, that having moisture to that seed, in that first few days, after planting to up to germination is really important. And if there's moisture in the soil, then typically you should be, you would be fine. But I think the challenge, and oftentimes people who are growing, spring cover crops or even fall cover crops, that moisture is there. But in the summer, if you're, planting into tilled fields, and there's less rainfall, it's possible that that moisture is not there. And if you do provide that irrigation, you're going to get the max potential benefit that cover crop can provide by rapidly establishing the seed, and getting growth as quickly as possible to suppress weeds or whatever your goal is for that cover crop. You'll have a better chance if you irrigate it, if there's no moisture or not much moisture in the soil.
Awesome, thank you.
Mhm.
So we've got two questions about roller crimping. The first question is, and so maybe I'll pitch both of these to you at once, Maria. So did you try planting the cover crops in the walkways to control the weeds and then do roller crimping? So roller crimping just in the walkways. And thinking about the scale of that, the other question is, are there any small scale roller crimpers, specifically pushed or hand driven?
Yeah, good question. So for this project, we were first trying to understand whether sun hemp could be rolled. So we just were growing it in one big plot. These were about 12 or 15 by 40 feet plots, and just rolling. And then the idea was to transplant into that. Some of the research that I'm interested in is something that's being done in corn and soybean production, but not yet that I know of in vegetable production, is the idea of delayed termination of cover crops. So planting, many folks are planting soybeans into standing rye and then terminating it. And when the soybeans reach like their first or second trifoliate leaf. And I'm interested in the potential to do that with vegetable production, especially if there's a cover crop that has potential to be rolled, but the timing to wait until rolling is effective is later in the season. So those are some next questions that I have. As far as equipment, there is a BCS, I believe, roller crimper. And there's also a small horse-drawn roller crimper. And then I've also seen some of these tools, poor man's roller crimper, which, it's manpower using it, but just sort of like thinking of like a big broad fork that has the ability to crush the stems in a similar way. So there are several ways that it can be done on a smaller scale.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I've seen people do almost like how you would make a crop circle where you've got a 2x4 and a piece of rope and you're kind of just stepping the cover crop down. One challenge with that is that crimping in the stem. Part of the reason the chevron pattern was, modified, tweaked, adjusted was, research demonstrated that you needed to have that stem physically crimped in about 3 different places for successful cover crop termination of that cereal rye. So that's something to consider with, some of the walk behind or hand methods is it might take a couple of attempts, like, okay, we're going to do it this week and we're going to come back next week and then it'll be dead. So just something to consider. And maybe sounds like maybe we should put together a more in-depth roller crimping cover crops presentation for next time.
I think that's a good idea. And I just want to, that reminded me, another reason why the roller crimper is successful is because of the weight behind it. And so I've seen people struggle with roller crimping because the machine that they're using, or they've made their own, there just isn't the weight behind it as well. And so I haven't seen the BCS or the horse-drawn roller crimpers in action, but I would be curious to know if there's enough weight behind it, or like Christine mentioned, if you need to do multiple passes, and that would suffice.
Yep, definitely a factor to consider. So we have someone that has a question kind of back to like, how do we plant our cover crops? Is there a difference in cover cropping methods when you are planting seeds directly? And so maybe if you could suss out some differences in cover cropping methods. I'm trying to suss out if they're interested in broadcast versus drill to establish the cover crops, or if they're curious about differences in cover cropping for I'm putting in bean and pea and sweet corn seeds versus transplanting cabbage and tomatoes. So maybe you want to unpack it both directions, Maria. I don't know.
Yes, so I guess going off the first one, drilling versus broadcasting, it depends. So for that first study that we did, we actually seeded the cover crops using a drop spreader, that's very much like broadcasting. And then we just came through with a harrow and a cultipacker to firm the seed bed and get good seed soil contact. And then that seemed to work well. So the drill, it's good if you have it, but obviously the thing, you have to make sure that the drill is dialed in well and it's not getting clogged and things like that. So the broadcasting can still be a good method as long as you ensure that there's that good seed to soil contact. As far as crops go, mostly my work has been using transplants planted after cover crops have been like mowed and really tilled in. So some pretty intensive soil management, except for this new work that I'm doing with the rolling the sun hemp. But it does seem that when you have, the high amounts of residue, transplanting into them can be better, although there's definitely been some work that has been done, no-till seeding pumpkins into rolled cereal rye, that seems to can be successful, as well as probably some other crops.
Yeah, and there are some great resources. I guess we haven't highlighted this yet tonight, but SARE, SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education, has some awesome free publications about cover cropping. And that might be a great place to kind of check some of the what we call those plant back periods for things like if you are tilling that cereal rye into the soil, there's going to be some allelopathy, which means it's going to try to prevent other things from growing. It's kind of a plant defense mechanism. Or if you're using things like yellow mustards or some of the things in the brassica family, again, when you crush those plant cells with mowing and tilling into the soil, they have some natural biofumigation properties, which is great for suppressing weeds, can also be useful for suppressing some plant pathogens, but might make it a little difficult to directly seed your beans or peas or carrots. So again, having a little bit of a window, sometimes it's as few days as 4. For some things, it's waiting up to 2 weeks. So definitely something to consider. So now I want to highlight, we're nearing the end of our time and we have a few more questions that I've got pinned for Q&A that I'd love to address. So again, we'll spend a few more minutes with Dr. Bilenky to answer the rest of these questions. So Maria, if you're planting into that cover crop residue, can you just explain again, what does that residue do in terms of nitrogen? Is there nitrogen tie-up that we should be worried about?
So with the cover crops, the ones that I mentioned that, were high carbon, high biomass, yes, there could be, and we even saw that without having a residue on the soil when we, in the first project I talked about at Iowa State, where we were even tilling the cover crops, and we were seeing some tying up of nitrogen, especially following, like the teff, the sorghum Sudan grass, and things like that. And that's why I mentioned potentially waiting a little bit of time to have that cover crop break down, or applying some supplemental nitrogen at the time of planting your vegetable crop. And so similarly, if you have that residue, thick carbon residue on the soil surface, you could see something similar. And that's why I have this interest in, this sun hemp as a rolled cover crop for no-till vegetable production.
Awesome. This one should be pretty quick and easy. Are there different varieties of buckwheat, so named varieties? And if yes, what variety would you recommend?
That's a good question. I can't remember off the top of my head what the buckwheat variety was that I used.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, when I've used buckwheat, I think it was just buckwheat, like variety not stated, which can be pretty common in cover crop seed. I think we see a lot of named varieties used in cereal rye cover crops, and we see it a lot in the clovers too, which the clovers tend to be one of the pricier cover crops. So I think from my time putting buckwheat in a high tunnel when we were at Iowa State, I don't think I had a named variety. But if you think of one and you want me to pass it along, Maria, please do.
Yeah, I'll have to
Please
check that.
let me know. All right, so 2 questions about winter killing. So of all the cover crops that you talked about tonight, do those all winter kill? Because we have someone that's really interested in that. And someone just wondering a great recommendation for maybe kind of a fall cover crop that would winter kill successfully.
Yeah, so all the cover crops I mentioned specifically like warm temperatures and will most likely winter kill. I would be very surprised if they didn't. And so, yeah, if you were looking for a cover crop that was going to winter kill, you could use those, as long as, you would have to have your timing right, because like I mentioned, buckwheat, it goes from vegetative to flowering really quickly. So you wouldn't want to plant it too early if you were thinking about growing it to winter kill, because when it does go to seed, it's really good at reseeding itself, which it's not that hard to get rid of with tillage. But if, for example, you're doing no-till or something like that, you will have buckwheat the next spring. So So yeah, but all of those will winter kill. What was the other part of the question?
Yeah, so just the general questions about like what winter kills well in fall planting. So I think you got to the heart of the matter.
Okay.
So Maria, this is kind of a different angle, but I think this is actually a fun question to wrap up on. So this will be our last question of the night. So the first survey question, we had an astute participant notice that, you define cover crops as non-revenue crops. But there are examples of cover crops that are primarily used to improve soil health, but also provide a useful product or revenue. Can you speak to, ways that cover crops can provide additional revenue for a farm, such as use of cover crops for pasture and synergy of livestock with cover crops? Because I realize that might be a direction you're going.
Yeah, so in general, that is, how a cover crop has been defined, and the benefits that we get from them are indirect, right? We're not selling the cover crop and getting money in return, but we are, by planting cover crops, we're investing in, the long-term soil health, ecological weed management, as well as, pest management by breaking up pest cycles and things like that. So, indirectly, we can be profiting from cover crops in that way. There are some folks who do actually grow cover crop seed and sell it. So I don't know if that counts as cover cropping, because then it becomes a cash crop. And then as far as, using cover crops as forages, there are plenty of folks who are starting to experiment on, or use that on their farms as a way to, increase, or even increase the forage options or length of time on forages before having to switch to hay, things like that, which again, is maybe somewhat more direct, but again, maybe indirect as well, by, potentially offsetting hay and other forage and feed costs, if you can do that.
Awesome. Well, Maria, I have one closing question that I'm going to pitch to you from me, and I'll give you a minute to ruminate on it. But given your numerous research and practical farm experiences, for anyone in the audience who is, considering getting started in vegetable farming, maybe a piece of advice you'd have for them, and I'll let you ruminate on that for a moment. In the meantime, thank you everyone for tuning in. Again, really appreciate whether you tuned in for the first time tonight or you stuck with us for all 4 sessions. I want to highlight that myself and some of my wonderful colleagues are going to be doing a specialty crop hour 3-part session in March. And if you go to the SDSU Extension website, you can find the sign up for specialty crop hour. And if you want to dig more into weed management for vegetable production, that's going to be one of the sessions that I'm leading. And it seems I might need to add a little more discussion about roller crimping and some of my cereal rye work along the way. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. And Maria, what advice do you have for beginning farmers?
I would say, talk to other farmers and, see what they're doing, especially those that are in your area. What has been successful, and, try things. I know it can be, scary and risky, but, trying some of those things that other farmers are doing that have been successful, and also trying to keep your soil covered as well, can also go a long way.
Yeah, especially in South Dakota, we're trying to keep it from blowing away more than anything. So that's what we're up to. And if you're looking to, network with other farmers and people who care about soil health and vegetable production, built how to build high tunnels, cut flowers, we are in the process of planning some really fun summer events. Hopefully no rain guaranteed. So if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our garden and yard newsletter. I do put all of our in-person field days and events in that newsletter as well. So that's a great way to maybe find a spot to check out what's going on in person and meet another farmer along the way. So, well, Maria, this has been absolutely wonderful. It was a delight to reunite with you virtually. Again, thank you to our entire audience. And this concludes the 2024 South Dakota Virtual Vegetable Short Course. Have a great evening, and we'll see you at the next event virtually or in person.
Great. Thanks, Christine.